Hi guys, I am going to talk to you really quickly about section 13.4 in our textbook, and it is food chains and food webs. So this section actually goes over the models called food chains and food webs, and they both show different ways that energy is transferred through organisms in an ecosystem. So if you're following along, here is where we are in the textbook. If you have a textbook, you can turn to page 408, and it shows figure 13.9. So it gives us just a basic food chain. I'm trying to show you what this picture looks like. Bear with me. There we go. Somewhere over there. Mostly. Okay, so the food chain that they show here is basically just links different species based on what they consume, basically who eats who. So it only gives you a certain connection. It doesn't explain how everybody in the ecosystem fits together. My hair is sticking up, excuse me. How everybody in the ecosystem fits together, just a small number of individuals. So it shows a connection between, say, one producer and then one or two consumers. So food chain is simple compared to a food web, where a food web is far more detailed. When you examine a food web, you should be able to pick out several different food chains. So if you have a textbook again and you're in class, if you would turn to page 410, give you a second to do that if you already have your textbook. On page 410, there is a food web, and it is figure 13.11. In this food web, you'll see several different food chains. So I want you to take a second to look and compare the food web that's on page 410. It looks like this. Compare the food web that's on page 410 to the simplified food chain that's on page 408. If you can see that, hopefully I'm getting it. Yep, there you go. And you'll see, again, simple relationship for a food chain, starting with the grass, the grama grass, that's the producer in that food chain in figure 13.9. And then it moves on to the primary consumer, the desert cottontail, and then there is a secondary consumer, and that is the Harris hawk. On page 410, you can see several different food chains that are in the food web. So the food web shows feeding relationships between trophic levels. And remember, a trophic level is basically how nourishment are leveled or organized within a food chain. So it shows levels of nourishment, basically, again, who eats who or who's eating what. So if you look at the food web again, you should be able to pick out several different food chains. Go ahead and do that now. If you have picked out a food chain from the food web on page 410, I actually want you to go ahead and write that down for me if you're taking notes, because I'm going to come back and ask you an example of a food chain that you identified in that food web. Just one for now so that you can share it with me quickly, but find one food chain within that food web. What you also can take away from a food chain or a food web are these terms that we use to describe different types of consumers. You guys are really familiar with a lot of this information, but the consumer types are listed on page 409. There's the bell. Herbivores, carnivores, omnivores, detritivores, and decomposers. Detritivores and decomposers are related to each other, where a decomposer is actually a type of detritivore. Other special types of consumers other than those two, I think those are two that you guys might be most confused about. So when you're considering detritivores and decomposers, remember that the detritivores eat detritus, which is dead or organic matter. No, you're fine. Hi. dead organic matter. And then the decomposers actually break down. So think about what a fungus does when a fungus is breaking down, or they decompose a organism or an animal that is already dead. Let's see. And then the other two types that are mentioned, specialist and generalist. So a specialist is an organism that only relies on a specific food source. One example that's listed in your textbook is that Florida snail kits, they actually eat only apple snails. You could think about brown bears, they really only eat salmon and stuff like that. You, from your quiz, you would be considered a generalist because you don't rely on one thing. So in order for you to be a generalist, you would only eat, and we mean only, or heavily rely on one specific food source, meaning the majority of your diet might come from eating chicken breasts, and that's all you eat. There's no sides, there's no rice, there's no salad, there's no honey buns, there's no Cheetos, there's no strawberries, bananas, no oatmeal, nothing, just chicken breasts. Then you would be a specialist. But you, as you are classified, you are a generalist. The remaining information in 13.4 just goes back over the food chain, food web, trophic levels. Actually, that's it. I think that's it for 13.4. So you should be able to show me. Everybody say hi to Hunter, because Hunter just walked in on my video. You should be able to show me your one example from the food web that's found on page 410 when I return to class. And that concludes section 13.4. Next section is 13.5, which is cycling of matter. So for section 13.5, what I want you to do is look at pages 412 through pages 416, and each one has a figure. I want you to follow along with your book. The first figure on page 413 is figure 13.12, and it is of the hydrologic cycle. There's a small figure at the bottom right, figure 13.13, the oxygen cycle. Figure 13.14 on page 414 shows the carbon cycle. And then on page 415, figure 13.15 shows the nitrogen cycle. The last cycle shows the phosphorus cycle. It's on page 416. And it's figure 13.16. Again, that's the phosphorus cycle. So I want you to make a list for me. Please list the following cycles in your note. Number 1, hydrologic cycle. Hydrologic cycle basically is how water cycles throughout the Earth's atmosphere and the organisms on the Earth. The next one, your second cycle, starts with descriptions of how elements are actually cycled throughout the Earth. The first one, this is your number 2, but these are based on elements. So the first one for the elements is going to be the oxygen cycle. And of course, that talks about how oxygen flows through the atmosphere and how it is made available to organisms. The big picture here is that without plants, we wouldn't have the oxygen that is produced that is needed for living organisms. And that's the majority how we get those back into the atmosphere. Cycle number 3, our second element cycle, is going to be the carbon cycle. The carbon cycle, which most of the carbon is produced by respiration and photosynthesis that cycles throughout. Our next cycle is going to be the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen fixation is important in this cycle. So there are little bacteria that's associated with the roots in plants, and they actually fix nitrogen. What that means is that they make nitrogen into a usable form. So nitrogen as it occurs is not usable. So this process is called nitrogen fixation, where certain bacteria will convert nitrogen into ammonia. The next element cycle is going to be the phosphorus cycle. This one is cool because it actually uses weathering, which are the conditions that occur from how the weather impacts ecosystems, to release phosphorus for organisms. Most of the phosphorus comes from soil and rocks, and that's how it's released so that organisms can consume and get the phosphorus that they need. So if you have your list should be complete for those cycles, starting with number 1, hydrologic cycle. The first element cycle, but your second cycle on the list should be oxygen. The third should be carbon. The fourth should be nitrogen, and the fifth should be phosphorus. Examine all of those figures and make sure you understand what and how the components are released and produced, and please add those to your notes. And we will discuss all of these tomorrow. Thank you.